All right, today we're going to start factoring. So what we've done so far is we've added and subtracted polynomials, we've multiplied polynomials, now we're going to factor polynomials. And factoring polynomials is really the opposite of multiplying. Okay, the first thing that we have to understand is we have to know how to find the greatest common factor. The greatest common factor, we'll abbreviate that, the GCF, greatest common factor. And what you want to ask yourself is what monomial would divide into, what's the largest number, largest variable that would divide into both of those terms? Okay, so let's start with the coefficient. Coefficient of 15, and we've got a constant of 18. What's the largest number that divides into both of those? Okay, that's a 3. You would say 3. Okay, and then do they have an x squared in common? Would x divide into both of those? And the answer is no. This has an x squared. This does not, so only 3 is going to divide into that. So the GCF of this is just 3. That's the largest value that divides in. Try this one. If I had 12x to the 5th plus 8x to the 4th minus 6x to the 3rd. Okay, I start with the coefficients here, or the constants. I've got a 12. I've got an 8, and I've got a negative 6. What's the largest value that divides into all 3 of those numbers? What common factor do they have? Okay, hopefully you said a 2. Okay, 2 goes into all of those numbers. Now, when you look at the variable part of it, okay, they all contain the same variable of x, and they all contain at least how many? When you have different exponents like that, you want to take the smaller exponent. So they all have an x in common, and the smallest exponent is 3. So a 2x to the 3rd is the greatest common factor. Okay, I'm looking for the greatest common factor here. Okay, when you look at these values, those coefficients, what's the largest value that divides into negative 18, positive 6, and positive 24? Okay, 6 actually goes into all of those. Okay, now if you said negative 6, you could use that too. But I'm going to keep it positive here. Okay, so we're going to use the 6. And then do they have a variable in common? And the answer is yes. They all contain y's this time. So they do have a y in common. And you want to take, in this case, the smallest exponent, which would be 2. Okay, they all have at least a y squared. Okay, so that's how you find the greatest common factor. Now we're also, it's going to go back and the directions are going to change a little bit on you, and that it's going to say, it's going to ask you to factor the polynomial, okay, by taking out the greatest common factor. So let's go back up to that example that we had of 15x to the, I think it was 2nd plus 18. Okay, it's going to ask you to factor this by taking out the greatest common factor. So we said the greatest common factor was a 3. Okay, now, if I take a 3 out of both of those terms, the question is, what would I have left? And this is kind of where we're undoing that multiplication that we did before. If you go back to that 7-2 worksheet where we took that monomial and we distributed throughout the polynomial, okay, factoring is deciding what monomial are you going to put out front and then what's left inside the parentheses. So if I take a 3 out of this, it's essentially dividing by 3. We're dividing. So if I divide both of those terms by 3, I would get a 5x squared plus 6. Okay, that is factored. I took out the greatest common factor, and this is what would remain. This polynomial would remain once I take out that greatest common factor. You can always check your work by going back and distributing. You can do this mentally. If I were to distribute 3 times 5x squared, I should get that 15x squared. 3 times 6, I should get 18. Okay, make sure that you have that. Okay, the second example up there was 12x to the 5th plus 8x to the 4th minus 6x to the 3rd. Okay, if the directions were asking you to factor this, okay, you would want to take out the greatest common factor, which we said the greatest common factor was a 2x to the 3rd. So that's going to sit out front, in front of the parentheses there. That's your monomial. And then you're going to figure out what would be left to go in parentheses. So we're going to divide each of these pieces by that greatest common factor. If I divide here, 12 divided by 2 is 6x squared. Okay, we divide the coefficients and we subtract powers when we divide. Okay, when I divide the coefficients here, 8 divided by 2 is 4. And I'm going to subtract the powers. So 4 minus 3, I would just get x to the first. Okay, when I divide here, negative 6 divided by 2 is a negative 3. And the x cubes are going to cancel each out. That would be x to the 0. If you subtract the powers, you get 0. So those x's are gone. So the factors I'd be looking at is here's the greatest common factor that I took out. And here's what would be left inside parentheses after I take out that greatest common factor. Okay, I'm going to give you a chance to get started on the worksheet, and then if we have questions, we'll answer those in class.